I'm building this signature structure in Wichita Falls, Texas for my model railroad, and it's going to include some kit bashing and some scratch building and a lot of fun on Ron Strange and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Strange and Things. Those who follow this channel regularly know that I've been working on a passenger station scene recently, but this week I've been waiting for some materials that I needed before I could continue, so I decided to work on a signature structure in my Wichita Falls, Texas scene that I have been looking forward to building for months. The structure is known as the world's littlest skyscraper, as dubbed by Ripley's Believe It or Not, all the way back in the late 1920s. The story behind the building is really a crazy and interesting one, but I'll tell you more about that in just a few moments. Now, I've planned to model this building for some time, and a few months ago I ran across a kit that would be a perfect starting point, but it was going to need to be heavily modified and still going to need to have some scratch building on the adjoining structure. So those are the things I'm going to be working on today as I prepare this signature structure for my Wichita Falls scene. So let's head over to the workbench and get started. This video is brought to you by Midwest Model Railroad. With 15,000 square feet of inventory and one-day shipping, whether in person or online, they are your one-stop model railroad shop. MidwestModelRR.com, link in the description. This is the building known as the world's littlest skyscraper, officially the Newby McMahon building, sitting just one block from the rail yard in Wichita Falls. The one-story Newby building was constructed in 1906 as an office building for the oil town. One of its tenants was J.D. McMahon and his oil rig construction firm. In 1919, at the height of the local oil boom, McMahon proposed an adjoining high-rise annex to the building to help meet the city's growing need for office space. Being directly across the street from the St. James Hotel, the location was ideal. McMahon raised over $200,000 from investors to build the proposed 120 by 216 by 480 building. Investors who did not read the blueprints carefully, in their haste, did not realize that these dimensions were actually in inches, not in feet. Thus, the building's actual size was 10 feet by 18 feet by 40 feet. McMahon used his own construction company to build the tiny building and ultimately left town and the state with the balance of the funds. The building was an embarrassment to the city of Wichita Falls. It was occupied initially for only 10 years until the oil boom locally went bust, was gutted by fire at one point, and was slated for demolition numerous times over the years. Today, however, the Newby McMahon building is on the National Registry of Historic Places and is home to an antique furniture and decor shop called Home Again. It's visually one of the signature structures in the Depot Square Historical District of Wichita Falls, and I knew that I simply had to have it on my layout. I recently ran across the Park Place kit by Lund Studios. The structure is too wide and too tall for the four-story portion, the little skyscraper of this building, but the architecture was similar and I thought it could be modified to represent the structure well. If you're not familiar with Lund Studios kits, they're cast resin structures representing a variety of old city architecture. I've built a few of their kits before and I find them enjoyable to work with. I started by cutting the kit down to size. This meant using a razor saw to cut off the top 2 stories of the structure, then to remove the cornice so I could attach it back to my model. I then cut the front down to a proper width. I carefully made these cuts along the natural separation lines on the model. I worked on a scrap of plywood to raise the model up and make it easier to get straight, accurate cuts with more room for the saw to move. I used sanding sticks to clean up the cut marks and prepare them for gluing. The best adhesives for resin are CA or superglue or 2-part epoxy. I didn't want to be mixing up small batches of epoxy all day, so I used gel type CA. I also used an accelerator to speed the setting of the CA. I studied the sidewalls for the best means of cutting them to the correct height, and I made those cuts. I cut the rear wall to size, but with the window configuration of the rear wall, I was unable to make the kit wall work. We'll come back to that in a moment. The windows on the side walls do not line up with one another across the building, so I had to make some adjustments on how I cut the width of those walls to ensure the integrity of the window openings. Making straight cuts on these tall walls with a razor saw was going to be complicated, so I set up a fence on my small bandsaw and cut them with that, which worked out perfectly. Here again you see the issue I had with the rear wall. The position of the window simply would not allow me to cut the narrow width that I needed, especially since I wanted to fit this wall in between the two side walls. I again sanded all of the cuts to make sure that they were square and smooth and ready for gluing. I then began gluing the walls together with CA using my magnetic gluing clamps to keep things square and secure. I know I've mentioned these clamps before, but I must say they're one of my most used and most useful tools for structure building, so I'm going to again include them in my Amazon pick of the week in the description down below if you'd like to check them out. When gluing these parts with CA, it's important to avoid using too much glue, as it will squeeze out and can mar the surface of the joint, and it can obliterate the model's details. Also, this spritzer bottle of Instaset Accelerator allows you to choose exactly when the glue hardens, which is fantastic. I'll add my CA and Instaset to the Amazon list in the description as well. The window trim in the kit comes in the form of a sheet made to fit on the back of each wall. The windows are my least favorite part of these kits, but they work okay. They are also made of resin, so I had to mark and cut them to size as well. They're thinner than the wall section, so I could cut them with my hobby knife. It's crucial that you take into consideration how the window trim sheet will interact with the wall's corner joints, as they can get in the way and cause serious fit problems. When cut to fit, I glued them to the inside of the walls with CA, clamping them in place with clothespins until the CA had set. I modified the front door opening to accommodate a custom door and window insert that more closely represents the prototype. I cut the door insert from 20 thousandths thick styrene. I then cut the kit's rear door and added it to the insert. I cut openings for a window adjacent to the door and a transom above the door, and installed window castings from Tichy Train Group. I used some scraps of scale lumber to add a header above the door and to trim below the window. To replace the rear wall, I ended up cutting a strip of Cabri brick sheet. This is 40 thousandths of an inch thick, and so it makes a sturdy wall. It also has nice brick detail, but in my case, this wall will be up against the backdrop, so it will never be seen. In hindsight, I should have simply used a scrap of 40 thousandths plain styrene and saved my brick sheet. When everything was test fit, I glued the second side wall in place, then added the rear wall. These miniature quick grip clamps are perfect for this job. With the 4-story portion assembled, it was time to take it to the paint booth. I prepared Tamiya XF2 flat white for the front door insert and XF57 buff for the front wall, which is blonde brick. For the red brick walls, I mixed a custom color. I had read a suggestion to mix 1 part yellow, 1 part blue, and 3 parts red, but this produced a mud gray color, so I kept adding red and white until I got a color I could live with. All of these colors were then thinned 1:3 paint to IPA for airbrushing. I masked around the front wall as I will paint the blonde brick first. Simple painter's tape is good enough for this step. I applied a good coverage with several light coats of these paints. I let the buff paint cure for a couple hours, then remasked the structure for painting the red brick sidewalls. It's also important to paint the top bit inside of the walls, as it will show above the roof later. When I removed the masking tape, I thought the base color looked pretty good, but it definitely needed some weathering. I added mortar lines and toned down the brick with a wash of Vallejo Air 71.045 cement gray. For the front wall, I used Vallejo Air 71.049 sea gray for this step, as the cement gray just blended into the buff brick. I let these paints dry, then built up the color some more with more layers of wash until I achieved the look I was after. I ended up adding some of the darker sea gray wash to the red brick as well to bring out and age the mortar lines. Let me pause here for a moment to say that if you're enjoying this video and you'd like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques to help you build a better model railroad, then be sure to subscribe down below and click that little bell icon so you can catch future videos. The door and windows in the door insert got a coat of Tamiya XF25 light sea gray with a brush. This paint has a bit of green tint to it, which somewhat matches the prototype, although it was definitely darker than I had hoped. I painted the window headers and seals of the capstone buff, and then the window sashes I painted white. The white took a couple of coats to cover well. I cut the window glazing and installed it to the backs of the walls with canopy glue so as not to haze the glazing with CA. I used a scrap of 40 thousandths styrene to cut a simple roof for the structure and sanded it to fit. A couple of strips of 1/10 of an inch square stock were installed into the sidewalls to support the roof. I also painted the roof with a base coat of dark gray or grimy black color. Again, it took a couple of coats to really cover, and then I glued it in place. I later used a couple of washes to weather and vary the color of the roof for a more realistic look. I don't intend to detail the interior of this structure, so I cut a strip of black cardstock to slip into the building to block light between the windows on opposing sides of the building from passing through. With the McMahon building largely done, I turned to the single-story newbie building. I used a sheet of paper on the layout to draw and cut a template for the footprint of the structure as it would fit into the scene. I used my reference photos and some educated guessing to figure the height of the walls. I cut a floor and the basic walls from 40 thousandths of an inch styrene. I needed to know the size of the doors and window openings so I could cut those, so I chose some Tichy Train Group door and window castings. I modified the doors to look more like the prototype, primarily by removing the mullions from the windows of the doors. The side door, which will face forward on the layout, is a double door. I didn't have a double door on hand, so I created one with 2 single doors and some narrow strips of styrene. I included a strip between the doors, trim around 3 sides, and a flat threshold. I similarly joined pairs of large windows together with narrow strips of styrene for the front wall windows. I'm compressing the depth of this structure from 3 offices to 2 to fit the space. I marked the placement of these doors and windows in the walls, then removed most of the material with a nibbler and sanded and filed the openings to size and fit. I then cemented the walls of the structure together onto the foundation with solvent cement. Here again are those magnetic 90-degree gluing clamps in use. For the brick on this building, I used Plastruct number 91606 sheet brick. Honestly, I don't love the brick pattern on this product as much as I do some other brick sheets on the market, but it isn't terrible and I had this on hand. The reason that I built the base structure from plain styrene first is because this product is only 20 thousandths of an inch thick, so it would be too flimsy on its own. Thus, I laminated it to the styrene base structure. I carefully cut each wall to match the base structure, making sure the door and windows matched and fit properly. It's important here to make purposeful decisions about how the corners will meet and lap so that you get the best look from the primary viewing angles. I fit the laminate very carefully and cemented it to the structure with solvent cement. I didn't install the brick lamination on the rear of the structure as that will be up against the backdrop and never seen. Again, the top portion of the walls inside of the roof area will be visible, so I cut narrow strips of lamination to cement in these areas as well. I cut more strips of 1/10 of an inch square strip for roof supports and cemented them to this brick laminate before I cemented it inside the walls. The sidewalls stepped down from front to back like the prototype, and as is typical on structures of this age and style. I cut the step down from the lamination after it was cemented in place to match the base structure. When the structure was assembled, I sanded the wall tops to make sure everything was flush. I used a couple of sections of cornice from DPM's modular wall system, part number 60132. I cut and cemented two of these together into a single cornice section, then cut it to length and modified the sidewalls to accept it and cemented it into place. I also laminated this area on the back with the plastruct brick. I capped all of the laminated walls with evergreen scale models number 134, 30 thousandths by 80 thousandths of an inch strip. I marked and cut and fit a roof from 40,000 styrene. At this point, I realized that I had miscalculated the roof height such that the second floor windows on the taller structure were going to be split by the roof on this structure. I fixed this problem by cutting 2 layers of 40,000 styrene to create a pair of steps and a raised foundation for the taller building, thus raising the windows just above the roof line. Then it was time for paint. The doors and windows got a coat of white with an airbrush, then the doors and window sashes got a coat of the same Tamiya light sea gray that I had used on the door previously. For the wall cap course, I mixed about 50-50 Vallejo color number 70.982 Cavalry Brown and white. I painted all of the caps with this color as well as the cornice on the front since it was darker than the walls. The new foundation and steps for the taller building got a coat of Vallejo cement gray. Before installing the doors and windows, I added window glazing to each with canopy glue. I then made sure each fit perfectly and cemented them to the structure. I cut and added an awning to the front of the structure using a scrap of evergreen metal siding sheet. This was from my scrap box, so I don't know which style exactly. I just grabbed what I thought looked right. I didn't paint the brick itself on this part of the structure as I thought the color that it came in would be fine, but I treated it with the same cement gray wash that I had used earlier in a few coats until the brick and mortar pattern stood out. There's a great deal of variation of color on the prototype where various structures have intersected with the building in the past and where damage has been repaired, so I tried to subtly replicate this variation with these washes. When that was dry, I did add some dry brushed streaks with the Cavalry Brown and white mix that I used earlier. I applied the same treatments to the brick inside the roof area. Off camera, I applied a base coat of light gray to the canopy. I then measured and marked the placement of the awning supports on the front wall. I cut tiny 40 thousandths of an inch square pieces for gussets where these supports connect to the wall, and then cemented them in place where I had marked. I then cut pieces of 20 thousandths of an inch styrene rod, a scale 6 foot long for support rods, and cemented them to the gussets and the top of the awning. I very carefully painted the rods and the gussets burnt umber. I created downspouts to match the prototype with short bits of 1/10 of an inch square stock, which I sanded to shape, and pieces of 40 thousandths of an inch styrene rod. I fashioned an electrical panel, laminating a couple of 30 thousandths by 80 thousandths of an inch strips together and cutting them to a height of about 14 scale inches, then attaching a conduit made of 20 thousandths of an inch rod. I used solvent cement to soften the end of this rod and bent a weatherhead into the top, but I ended up breaking it off and losing it before it got to the layout. The downspouts and electrical conduit are galvanized, so I painted them with Vallejo Air number 71.062 aluminum. I prepared some roof detail castings, namely an AC unit, some ductwork, and a vent. These are castings from various sources that I had on hand. I painted these and the electrical box with Vallejo Air number 71.050 light gray. Off camera, I airbrushed the roof white. I highlighted the details on the roof castings with a wash of sea gray, and I installed all of these detail parts with canopy glue. I lightly weathered the roof with a light wash of light gray. I didn't glue the roof in place in case I want to add some interior details or lighting later. I added a wash of burnt umber weathering to the awning. To model the store sign, I fashioned a bracket from 2 pieces of evergreen number 291, 60 thousandths of an inch angle. I cemented them together at a 90-degree angle. I then cut a small sign 3 scale feet square out of 20,000 styrene. I painted the bracket burnt umber. I cut 2 short pieces of brown thread and glued them to the back of the bracket and the back of the sign, then installed the sign above the main door on the front wall with canopy glue. A final and crucial detail was to add this hand-painted election sign to the side of the building. This detail would absolutely make the model to anyone who had ever seen the structure, in my opinion. I used a simple photo editors to straighten the sign, then printed a decal using my inkjet printer and white water slide decal paper for inkjets. I sprayed the decal 3 times with glossy lacquer to seal the ink, allowing each layer to dry completely before applying the next. I then cut out the decal and soaked it in some distilled water to loosen it from the backing paper. Distilled water is important for decals as it can reduce the silvering that can be caused by using tap water with minerals. I applied it to the model with microscale microset. I hoped that the brick of the decal would match that of the model, and I think it worked out pretty well. When I had the decal in position, I used a makeup sponge to wick up most of the water and make sure the edges were sealed. When the moisture was mostly wicked away, I applied some microsol to help the decal conform to the contours of the brick wall, and I let that dry completely. Once it had, I gave the wall a quick light coat of dull coat to seal everything in. After that was dry, I applied one more wash of concrete gray to parts of the decal and around the edges to blend it into the wall. I know I kind of went down a rabbit hole with this project, but I'm really glad to have a model of this building on my layout, and I'm very happy with how it turned out. I love how it looks across the street from my model of the Holt Hotel in Wichita Falls. And to see how I kit-bashed the Holt Hotel and other model railroad content, check out the links on your screen. Don't forget my Amazon picks of the week and other valuable links in the description down below, and join me for future installments as I bring you even more great model railroad videos, and I'll see you on the next video. 10, Lizzie?